advanced branch in English at UConn, and he lives in New York City. And the last time he spoke, he took the train from New York City and the bus to Stores, and we took him out to lunch. I'd also like to say Oscar Wilde is one of my favorites, and he was definitely my son's favorite writer when he was growing up. So we're very, very happy to have Fred come and talk to us about Oscar Wilde. Fred?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be with you virtually, but I can assure you I would much prefer to be with you in person. I love the interpersonal interaction. It's the favorite part for me of teaching and lecturing. The research component of what we do, even the leadership roles can have their own satisfaction, and anybody who's been an administrator can either agree or disagree with me about that. But my favorite part is interacting with folks about the energy, the passion that we have with what we can study together. So we're going to try to optimize to the best of our ability today some of that interpersonal interaction. And so I want you first to feel absolutely free to interrupt me at any point that you'd like to pose a question, because I think it's more important that we have communication in order to create community than to have some sort of, unbroken flow of my presentation. I want to tell you how I have kind of envisioned this. I've worked on Wilde in one way or another for close to 30 years. I've edited 2 guides to Oscar Wilde studies. If there is a major author that I have a specialization in, it's Wilde, as somebody who works on the late 19th century British literature. But, I have to say what strikes me about Wilde is the diversity of his voice. We usually associate him with that sort of scintillating wit of the importance of being earnest, those amazing one-liners that he can crank out in these epigrams. Just about every college student, by the time they have entered college, they have already read Dorian Gray in high school. So this is a figure that we have a lot of fluency in. But I think someone engineered the title of something like Another View or Another Perspective. And that is indeed what I'm going to be talking with you about today. And when I've given versions of this talk before, I sometimes call it the wisdom of Oscar Wilde. And wisdom sounds a little heavy, and it certainly sounds heavy for Oscar Wilde. But what I'd like to do is think about 2 prose works that Wilde wrote, one in 1891 called The Soul of Man Under Socialism, and someone whom we associate with the beauties of material culture and a lavish and luxurious life, we wouldn't necessarily associate with socialism or socialist thought. And the second is a work called De Profundis, or From the Depths, which is the letter that Wilde wrote in prison. It's a letter, but it's 100 pages long. And it's probably his longest, what I might call philosophical tract. So I just want to start out by giving you a couple of themes that we're going to be thinking about in the course of my presentation. And I'm going to shift between a PowerPoint where I'm sharing the screen and my own speaking to you about some of the material. So here are some of the themes. Individualism and conformity or nonconformity, the notion of perfection and what Wilde will call the realization of one's personal perfection, which he talks about in a very religious sounding word, the soul. Surprisingly enough, we will be talking about the figure of Christ and Christianity in Oscar Wilde's works, whom he actually compares to an artist, and one can see by extension, he's also comparing himself to Christ as a kind of Christ figure. Another theme in Wilde that we certainly wouldn't expect if we know Wilde's plays is the theme of suffering and the theme of personal suffering and the transformations that it brings. So these are all, I'll say, rather serious and heavy themes. And I don't want you to feel like this is going to be a lecture that is a February low light distance learning lecture that's going to make you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. Rather, what I would suggest, hopefully by the time we get to the end of our time together, we'll have a sense that even those authors that we associate with the pleasures of the superficial and the enjoyment of the moment have depths. And similarly, that those depths that all of us have experienced in our own lives have aspects of the beautiful to them. Those depths that we have delved into that we may not have chosen, right, can still become moments of personal transformation, as well as ways of talking about the collective experience of being human. And that's what I found so interesting some 30 years ago, that an author whom I found absolutely fascinating in other ways also dealt with serious subjects about how we should live. So that's a bit of an intro to the talk itself. Now, I'll just give a quick announcement in terms of a piece of strategy. I mentioned before we got started, for the folks who were here early, I have put into the chat my email address. So if after this talk is over, after our time together concludes, you find that either you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint that I'll be occasionally shifting to share my screen with, so you see either quotations or possibly there are some images there. If you'd like that, I'm happy to email that to you. Similarly, if you decide that there are some questions that you think of after our time together is over, I want you to know that you're welcome to reach out to me, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So thank you for having me back. It's delightful to be here. And let me show you a quick slideshow of a few images before we start thinking back on those themes. So I'm going to trust you to tell me if you're not finding that the PowerPoint is showing. Can someone tell me, can you see my title right now? Okay, I see a nod, terrific. So I'm calling this The Wisdom of Oscar Wilde. So I just want to show a few Wilde images. This is probably the Wilde that we think of. The fur lapel, the elaborate velvet suit, the long hair, and note for the Victorian period, the lack of a beard, right? So he's rejecting, that kind of Victorian high seriousness as a young man. And this is one of the most famous photos of Wilde taken during his American tour. And see that languor, that sense not only of an incredible backdrop, but that dreamy look, looking in the distance, the bent knee, the bit of a slouch, if you will, for you art historians, drawing a little bit on the classical contrapposto. Someone is requesting to annotate. I don't know what that means. But in any case, we have this dreaminess associated with Wilde. And let's see that I can turn. And we also have parody associated with Wilde. Wilde said he couldn't be sure he'd live up to his blue and white china, right? And here we have the very popular import of the time, the blue and white china. We also have the sunflower, a symbol of the aesthetic movement. And this quite too utterly utter, as it said, is actually from a promotion for a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta called Patience. Patience actually satirized the art for art's sake movement. And the funny thing about this is we think of Wilde as putting art before life, but in fact, Wilde was a very keen materialist. He was also a very shrewd businessman. That's to say, in his American tour, he coordinated his lectures with the Gilbert and Sullivan production, so that the very production that lampooned the art for art's sake movement was something that would make people want to buy tickets to his lectures, so that they could say, what is this all about, this art for art's sake movement. So he was quite a shrewd self-promoter. He would have been on Instagram, Snapchat, you name it. He would have had as many followers as you could imagine. And here's one of the satirical drawings by Max Beerbohm of Wilde lecturing in America. And notice the Americans look very serious. You know, they're bearded. We've got Abe Lincoln on the wall and the American flags. And then you have this kind of bloated figure with the hand outstretched, holding a calla lily and wearing a ring on his finger, looking very, very different from these rather sober Americans. And here's another Beerbohm caricature of Wilde that really goes to this area of the grotesque that we sometimes associate with Wilde. As some of you may know, Wilde was tried and imprisoned for crimes of gross indecency. He served 2 years of hard labor. Gross indecency today would be crimes of homosexual acts. So we'll come back to his personal life in just a second, but you may notice in this image these somewhat overdone fingernails. Again, this element of the bloating, the kind of frou-frou bouffant going on here. So there's this element of excess, if not effeminacy, associated in this image. But to return to these questions of Wilde and the feminine, Wilde was in fact married to Constance Lloyd, a woman, and he had 2 children with her, Cyril and Vivian. Cyril died in the First World War. Vivian lived to a ripe old age, and his son, Merlin Holland, is still very much with us and active in Wilde studies. You'll notice I say the name Holland rather than Wilde because after the Wilde trials and Wilde's imprisonment, the family had to change their surname because the Wilde name was so badly stained at that time. And Wilde, in fact, had gone bankrupt. He was famously spat at. There are all kinds of ways in which someone who had been truly a celebrity and had cultivated that culture of celebrity was someone who was, to quote him, in the gutter, even if he was looking up at the stars. And to speak in terms of Wilde and excess, here are the images by Aubrey Beardsley of the play Salome, taken from the story about John the Baptist and Salome and the Dance of the Seven Veils that you might know. So you have this way in which Wilde's art, including those who represented his works, pushed the boundaries of, let's just say, Victorian morality. And this little fellow, who was the source of Wilde's problems, Lord Alfred Douglas, was Wilde's young male lover who encouraged Wilde to file a libel suit against Bosie, as he was called, Lord Alfred Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, when the Marquis made an accusation against him. And sadly, Wilde did so, and in fact ended up having 2 criminal cases posed against him. And again, this led to his own imprisonment. And Toulouse-Lautrec, the famous French artist, depicts Wilde roughly at the time of his trials as a much older man, although by this time Wilde was all of about 40, right? And again, these elements of excess of dress, but also the bags under the eyes, the sense of one who has lived in a way that hasn't necessarily led to good aging. Now, I want to start with a few quotations, and then we'll get back to maybe some discussion. We'll have the chance to kind of move between. And this essay on socialism comes out of a late 19th century conversation. Some of you may know the author, furniture designer, fabric designer, William Morris. I love Morris, by the way. Morris, too, was a socialist in the sense that he believed that the workman should not be a machine, should not be doing the work that machines could do in the devastating situation of industrial mass production, right? That everyone should have satisfaction in the work that they do. So Wilde took this into the realm of thinking more abstractly about art. And here's where we get into Wilde the philosopher. And I'll apologize for his generic gendering. I'm sure all of you are familiar of the times when people would say man rather than man or woman, or man rather than human. So throughout the Wilde quotations, we'll be using the masculine pronoun, even though he's speaking of humanity. So in a culture that's about production and productivity, Wilde speaks about being and becoming. The true perfection of a man, a person, lies not in what one has, but what one is. Know thyself was written over the portal of the antique or ancient world. Over the portal of the new world, be thyself shall be written. So Wilde's philosophy is going in this direction of what I'm calling individualism. Now, here's a long quote, and I'm not going to belabor all of it, but I'm going to give you a bit of it. It will be a marvelous thing, the true personality of humanity, when we see it. So Wilde's argument in this quotation, which again I'm willing to share with you if I send you the PowerPoint, is that instead of seeing who we really are, in the way in which society has socialized us to be certain kinds of figures, we have gotten removed from our inner selves. And the duty of the work of perfection, right, is to become closer and closer to who we are on the interior level. The end of this quotation: the personality of man will be very wonderful. It will be as wonderful as the personality of a child. And some of you may be familiar with the quote from the Gospels that in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, one needs to become as a little child. And in fact, this is what Wilde says about Jesus, not as a God, but as a kind of humanistic teacher, that Jesus said to humanity, you have a wonderful personality, develop it, be yourself. Again, this element of what we might think of as socialism. It's not in accumulating or possessing things, but rather your perfection is inside yourself. A short quote sums this up. Man reaches his perfection not through what he has, not even through what he does, but through what he is. And finally, on this page, he who would lead a Christ-like life is he who is perfectly and absolutely himself, right? So this is a philosophy that celebrates individualism and individual difference. Now, imagine how radical that is in a culture such as the late Victorian period that understood there to be one way of being, one way, conformity of behaving. Now, this has reminiscences of Darwin, right? That the variety found in the natural world is strategic and advantageous. Any of you who know the poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins that celebrates, as the title is called, Pied Beauty, that celebrates variety. We have this real reaction against Victorian morality and Victorian culture that you can fit a square peg into a round hole, that these artists and thinkers are challenging the notion that we're all supposed to be made out of a cookie cutter. And in fact, this is what Wilde says: all imitation in morals and life is wrong. There is no one type for humanity. There are as many perfections as there are imperfect people. One should not yield to the claims of what he calls conformity. And these are quotations that, again, I won't belabor here. You're welcome to ask for the PowerPoint and I'll send it to you. But Wilde argues that it's selfish not to become one's fullest, most developed, most highly realized self. It's selfish to hold back who you are authentically, because to try to be what society demands you to be, to, again, on the assembly line, in the mass production, or in this aspect of what we might call conformity, it starves the world. It prevents the world from having what uniquely you might bring to the world. Going to go through a few more things, and then we'll take a little break from my talking and see if there are some questions you'd like to pose. When man or humanity has realized individualism, he will also realize, Wilde uses the word sympathy, and exercise it freely and spontaneously. When Wilde uses the word sympathy, coming from the Greek, feeling the same, he's really closer to how we sometimes use the word compassion, right? And the Romantic poets, going back to Wordsworth, this is where this word sympathy comes from, speak of imaginative sympathy, the way in which you can truly be an artist and depict human life is by being able to understand the way in which people who are different from you feel and experience the world. That's how you can become an artist, right? So to fully become oneself is to be fully able to be sensitive to others' perspectives, to understand them, and not to deny the authenticity of oneself. So let me take a little break from this. I'm going to stop sharing so you can see me rather than just seeing a bunch of quotations, and ask you whether you have any immediate questions or comments before we go on to some other passages and some other issues I'd like to pose for you. I see a question that got written in the chat. Did I? The person's asking for a copy of the PowerPoint. I'll gladly send that, sure. And I'm sorry, sorry for your loss. Ronald, I guess it is. Sorry for your loss. In any case, comments or questions that you might have so far, tell me when you hear the name Oscar Wilde, does any of this sort of philosophy of life sound like what you would expect? I see a few shaking heads. Can anyone want to unmute him or herself? And I see a big hand. Bill, is it? Would you like to unmute yourself and make a statement or ask a question?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I did not start out this by knowing very much about Oscar Wilde.
Okay.
What I did know was that he just seemed to be a wit, and therefore I would have imagined him to be very flippant,
Right.
not a very serious person. So I'm learning a lot about him today. The observation I would make, though, is the mark of an intelligent mind is the ability to hold two different things at the same time. And on the one hand, he seems to be a rugged individualist, much like you would find, out west in the United States. On the other hand, he's branded as a socialist, someone who is sympathetic to the needs of other people. So he's both a libertarian and a socialist at the same time.
I love your comment because it points us toward the way in which we find in Wilde what would seem to be the mutually exclusive, these various contradictions. How can someone who was so lavish in his indulgence in material culture, right, and of food and drink and in fact sex too, I mean, you name it. I mean, it was the art for art's sake movement that blended into what we call decadence, the suggestion coming from Walter Pater's theories of the Renaissance that to live, to quote Pater for a moment, to burn with that hard gem-like flame is success in life. So the philosophy was a kind of carpe diem one, seize the day, and to live very fully. And that meant embracing the beautiful in sensory experience, but also in having the beautiful around oneself, right? And yet we've got these aspects of socialism. I want to go back for a moment just to where you started, to think about the Wilde works we know best, but also a bit about his biography that might shed more light on this. Wilde, as many of you probably know, was an Irishman rather than an Englishman, right? His father, Sir William Wilde, was a very famous eye and ear surgeon, and his mother, who called herself Speranza, was a salon lady. She held a salon of artists, radical intellectuals, thinkers of the particular time in Dublin. And she was also a poet herself, as well as a strong campaigner for Irish nationalism. So Wilde came from an unusual family himself, and he started his university education in Ireland prior to earning a scholarship to Oxford, and at the time of receiving his degrees, getting a double first, which is like being summa cum laude, and in two fields, as well as having earned the Newdigate Prize in poetry. So he moved into English society, but even as we associate him with this sort of upper class world that we see in the plays like The Importance of Being Earnest, that's not actually where he came from. And this isn't to say that his family weren't privileged. Even speaking on matters of religion, they were not among the Irish Catholics who were the second-class citizens that made up all of the Irish populace. Basically, his family were Protestant. He was, coming from a privileged, educated background, but he certainly was not the likes of the English aristocracy. And part of the brilliance of Wilde that you just described about the flippancy of his remarks is that when we think about some of his plays like An Ideal Husband, The Importance of Being Earnest, Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, and there have been film adaptations of these, so some of you may have seen the films as well as perhaps seeing some of them staged. What Wilde managed to do was portray the manners and morals and also the hypocrisies, double standards, and secrets of the English upper classes, while selling tickets to the English upper classes to fill the theater that was making him his fortune in the 1890s, when he really hit it big as a playwright and was spending money, I can't say like water, but like expensive champagne, and needed to earn money. So he was both a materialist, a capitalist, one might even say. He was a sellout when it comes to art, right? Because he needed to make that money to maintain that expensive lifestyle that he had. But he also was this person who was poking fun at the very people who were paying to see his plays. And I guess I'm thinking about his plays because that's where we see that flippancy of wit best. I'm not sure I fully responded, but I think I gave you something to gnaw on.
He sounds like a man of great contradictions. I mean, look
Great
at
comment.
look at his spiritual nature too. I guess the one observation I would make is he's a genius, and yet look at the terrible end that he came to.
Well, and this is, of course, what Wilde laments in De Profundis. If you should read the tract, I'll call it more a tract than a letter. He laments that he put his genius into his life and only his talent into his art. He laments that he could have done more, but he was so caught up in the pleasures of living, right, and living deeply, right, that as an artist he underperformed, or so he judges himself there. But great observations, and we'll be coming back to some of those points as we look at
Thank you.
some other points. Other comments or questions from folks at this time? Okay, so I've given you a little bit of the Wilde biography. Let me tease that out just a bit more before we go ahead. So Wilde wrote in a range of different genres. Um, any show of hands here? Any of you grow up being read his fairy tales or having read them to your children? So Wilde wrote fairy tales in which he, radically took on the central myths of the culture and made stories both for children as well as adults because he used that literary form to critique society as well. He wrote a novel much in the style of the European decadent novels, the ones in yellow papers because they were thought to be a bit risque. And it maybe is one of his best known works. I'm thinking of The Picture of Dorian Gray, but I think many of us would agree that it's not among his best of literary output. The same thing might be said of his poetry. In the Victorian period, if you want to be remembered as an artist, if you want to be a success as an artist, you are going to be a success as a poet or as a novelist. Those are the two genres in the 19th century. In poetry, he's at best mediocre. He's remembered for the Ballad of Reading Gaol that he wrote after imprisonment, that challenges the notion of capital punishment and seeks compassion for prisoners. Again, as I say, he only wrote one novel, and it's not a particularly good one insofar as the form is concerned, but it's certainly one that tells us a lot about the social history of the time. But what other things he did that we don't often hear about is work as an editor as well as a journalist. He edited a periodical called Woman's World, right? So among his circle were female artists and intellectuals, the so-called capital N, capital W, new woman of the end of the 19th century. So even as his plays are so much about marriage and the dynamics of power between men and women, and I could speak about his plays forever. In fact, his circle was a circle not only of the male artists and intellectuals that we see as dominating, but so too the female at the time. And by this time, Newnham College, Cambridge had been established. Women couldn't take degrees yet at Oxford or Cambridge, but they could study there. And in this cosmopolitan London world in which he lived, he mixed with all sorts of folks. And show you a kind of dark side of Wilde, and that's a figure that I've written on quite a lot, a man by the name of Marc-André Rafalovich, who came from France to England with a Russian Jewish banking fortune. And Marc-André wanted to publish poetry, and he bought a beautiful house and wanted to hold dinner parties there. And what Wilde said about him was that he came to London with the intention to found a salon, and he only succeeded in founding a saloon. And it's funny, we hear that, but there's also this double edge with Wilde, that he had Jewish writer friends such as Amy Levy, Ada Leverson, and so forth, and yet he also, in both the person of Marc-André Rafalovich, as well as in a character in Dorian Gray, the Jewish stage manager who is presented in a very derogatory way, we see some of the glimpses of the prejudices of the time. And the reason that I bring this up is that Wilde himself was among the lower races, as British culture would have seen it at the time. That's to say, Thomas Carlyle called the Irish as a race white Negroes. Okay, so the Irish were not looked at favorably in British culture at this time. So it's a very interesting thing to think about how Wilde was on the margins looking in. And that's something that helps us to think about this very cosmopolitan society he's living in, but also this sort of perspective from the margins that he's giving us. Some of it is the perspective of a man who loved other men, who went to prison for those acts, while the lover whom he had got off scot-free because he was an English aristocrat. There are many other things one could say about the Wilde trials, but I do think it's worth it to think about Wilde as a bit of an outsider in English culture, and that outsiderness is part of his humor and indeed his ability to manipulate the culture on his own terms. So let me go to this letter that Wilde wrote while in prison, because we think of things like the letter from Birmingham jail, right? We think of these sort of high moral tone of various people who have days named after them. We don't necessarily think of clever wits who got celebrated on the London stage and then end up as prisoners, as people who would write letters. So let's see if I can remember how to share my screen once more. Sorry about that. I just pushed the wrong window. So let me share screen and go to Microsoft PowerPoint and pull it up again and go to let's see, how do I go to full screen? Play from current slide. Okay, so are we on do you see the Oscar Wilde from De Profundis 1897? Great. Okay, it is only by realizing what I am that I have found comfort of any kind. So this is really where Wilde started in that 1891 essay, that you have to be who you are, and that being rather than doing. The full realization of it is, as it were, not only success in life, but kind of what we would think of as personal and public integration. This is a very poignant series of passages that I'm going to take the time to read, because I think that they're worth it. Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground. We who live in prison and in whose lives is no event but sorrow have to measure time by the throbs of pain and the record of bitter moments. We have nothing else to think of. Suffering, curious as it may sound to you, is the means by which we exist, because it is the only means by which we become conscious of existing. And the remembrance of suffering in the past is necessary to us as the warrant, the evidence of our continued identity. Between myself and the memory of joy lies a gulf no less deep than that between myself and joy in its actuality. Now, Wilde wrote this 100-page letter 1 page at a time. He was given 1 piece of paper at a time to write, and then he had to turn in whatever pages he had, right? Wilde had maybe 5 books in his prison cell. So he was allowed a very small number of books. We can sort of hear the clock ticking in a quote like this, right? That suffering, as he describes it, is the way in which one is aware while in what I'm going to call this liminal space, neither the past, the life that he had before he went to prison, nor this imagined future that he can't even be sure will be, right? So the present moment of suffering, which for some of us, if we've experienced deep suffering, we might relate to, or even if we haven't and living in a pandemic and not able to do a lot of things that we can do, we're very aware of what it feels like to be in that moment. And I proceed with this quotation: suffering is one long moment. We cannot divide it by seasons. We can only record its moods and chronicle their return. With us, time itself documents progress. It revolves. It seems to circle round the center of pain. So he takes great pains, no pun intended, to speak about how one remembers one is still alive. And, after having lost everything, he's not going to see his wife or children again. He's gone bankrupt. His reputation has not simply been dragged through the mud. He's in prison, and he's never going to rehabilitate his reputation because he's a criminal, according to the time in which he lives, right? What does he do with that? He turns that into a work of art. And that's what Wilde is doing here. This elaborate writing is the attempt to somehow remain not only human, but to remain an artist by turning this experience of suffering into something beautiful, to turn it into this elaborate work of literature. And this is where he begins delving into philosophy and theology. Love of some kind is the only explanation of the extraordinary amount of suffering there is in the world. Morality does not help me. Religion does not help me. The faith that gives others, that others give to what is unseen, I give to what one can touch and look at. Reason does not help me. So the abstract doesn't work for him. It's this element of feeling, of what we might call embodiment, of having a body, of having senses, right? He calls suffering not a mystery, but a revelation. So he turns this to this aspect of art and being an artist. At every single moment of one's life, one is what one is going to be no less than what one has been. The artist is always looking for that mode of existence in which the soul and body are one and indivisible, in which the outward is expressive of the inward, in which form reveals. And again, here he is in prison, having lost everything. And what is left to him but the mind that can create art? Truth in art is the unity of a thing with itself, the outward rendered expressive of the inward, the soul made incarnate, the body instinct with spirit. Now, let me just share with you something about the soul of man under socialism that was written 6 years before. At the end of that essay, even as he compares Christ to the supreme individualist, he says, you know what? Jesus failed because, he became a legend through suffering rather than through pleasure. And in this work, he turns that around and says that suffering is the way in which one can become indeed legendary. And Wilde indirectly compares himself to Christ. He makes himself a Christ figure. Christ's place is among the poets. He is the leader of the lovers. He saw that love was that lost secret of the world for which the wise men had been looking, and that it was only through love that one could approach either the heart of the leper or the feet of God. Christ is the most supreme of individualists. The very basis of his nature was the same as that of the nature of the artist, an intense and flame-like imagination. He realized, that word he's been using, in the entire sphere of human relations, that imaginative sympathy, the same word that we get in Soul of Man or Socialism, which in the sphere of art is the sole secret of creation. His whole conception of humanity sprang right out of the imagination and can only be realized by it. His entire life is also the most wonderful of poems. One of the books that Wilde had in his prison cell was a copy of the Greek Gospels. And the Gospels were written in a dialect of Greek, and having been to university, his fluency in being able to read Greek because if you went to Oxford at that time, you had to read Latin and Greek very well. This is what he was reading. And he was identifying with this figure. Now, I'm not going to read this entire quotation, but what Wilde suggests about Christ is that he gives voice to those who don't have the power to speak. It's a very beautiful passage, and again, I'll send this to you. I just don't want to read too much here. But Wilde says here that this figure, and this is what the artist should do, this figure looked to the margins, looked to those who were outside of society and gave them voice, and turned, through becoming the man of sorrows, turned that into something beautiful. So while we may, and I can talk about Wilde and religion per se, we may contemplate whether Wilde is embracing a particular kind of faith or not. He's certainly taking the major stories and the major figure, right, of Western culture and seeing those stories and seeing that figure through his own eyes, through his own lens. Christ's morality, this is the second quotation on this page, is all sympathy. What I suggest we mean when we say compassion, but compassion that allows us to create art, right? And he suggests in the last passage on that page that Christ is like a work of art, and gives the example of being on the road to Emmaus in the scriptural stories, right? That being brought into the presence of art, we are changed. That being brought into the presence of this, I'll just say his Christ is kind of like a Buddha, a fully realized, enlightened being, right? That somehow one is changed. And he's very critical of organized religion as having missed the boat, and suggests, nevertheless, that this icon of understanding suffering, and we certainly find that in Western art, is a means by which human suffering can better be understood, whether or not one embraces the religious. I won't read this last quotation because I'd like us to go back to our Q&A here, but he's drawn to this notion of the mystical, right? The esoteric, that there's something in spirit rather than in body that's going to give those answers, right? And art does the same thing, right? We can look at a painting, we can hear a symphony, we can read a work of literature, and we might try to explain it rationally by giving language to it, but we can't necessarily explain the realm of feeling. And what I would like to do now is to open up our conversation once more, so that whether you want to go back to any passages and talk about them, or whether you would like to ask some questions or make comments, this is what I had wanted to share with you, that the man who has fallen from grace takes the central figure in Western culture, turns him into an artist, just as he'd turned socialism into an artistic doctrine. He takes these things and inverts them. He turns things that we expect into lessons, meanings that we don't necessarily expect or couldn't have predicted. And, as I'm saying, he imagines that, as someone who has advocated for art and artists throughout his public celebrity, he suggests that the artist is a kind of God, that the artist is a kind of Christ figure, and that through his own, let's just say, crucifixion, through his own experience of public, not only humiliation, but public ruin, that he has been sacrificed in some way, but has also become a different and deeper person, and finds, as I was reading for you, finds through this experience of human suffering what we might call transformation, self-realization. So throwing that out for you, I'm open to questions, and if you'd like to look at any particular passages, just let me know and we can go there.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, please.
First of all, thank you. Very interesting. I did not have a great familiarity with Wilde, but I thought you did a great job of explaining not only what a witty figure he is, but a complex and his contradiction, between cosmopolitan and outsider. But I have a curiosity question.
Yes.
When he was in prison and he was given 1 page a day,
Yes.
and he wrote a letter a day, and then you said he handed it to somebody, right?
Right.
Who
And
published it? I mean, who saved it and who published it?
Okay, the prison warden kept it for him. There's a big controversy as to whether or not Wilde did have the opportunity in prison to revise the letter or not. But suffice it to say, 2 copies were made after his release from prison. The letter itself was addressed to this young man, Lord Alfred Douglas, Bosie Douglas. And the first half of the letter is vicious. And that's the part I didn't read for you. He's saying, I spent this amount of money on you for champagne, and I spent this amount of money for you on every possible lavish meal. I did all of these things, so that part is the kind of, the bitterness. But so Wilde did send a copy to Lord Alfred Douglas. Lord Alfred Douglas destroyed it, and the assumption was, ha, 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 I have now destroyed what Oscar Wilde wrote in prison. But in fact, the man who would become Wilde's literary executor, Robbie Ross, had a second copy of this work. And 20 years ago, when the Morgan Library in New York had a big exhibit on Wilde, one could see Wilde's own handwriting of De Profundis, of this work. It was first published in a particular version in the first decade of the 20th century after Wilde's death. There are many questions about errors and inconsistencies in the text, but it's become, a prison letter. It's become part of the Wilde canon. People who want to understand Wilde better go back to this. And the very question that you pose, how do we understand its survival? And for me as a scholar, how do we understand its editing, right? Are ones that we only have partial answers to. If that helps to answer your question a bit.
Yes, it did. Thank you. Just one follow-up.
Yes.
So did the prison warden have the insight or the intelligence to understand that there was a good reason to save this?
Of course, because as when any celebrity goes to prison, I could think of a few right now, but I didn't want to name anyone by name. But when any celebrity goes to prison, if they write something, it might be valuable. Do you read do you watch the Antiques Roadshow like I do? And somebody just happens to have gotten something because their father was a prison warden or whatever. But it was very clear that this was something valuable, even if Wilde would be disgraced. But to be fair, Wilde did get better treatment in prison when his health was suffering for hard labor. Hard labor meant the unraveling of rope, right? This meaningless, inconsequential act that laborers were forced to do in the 19th century in prison. Unraveling rope, all it did was make your hands bleed and keep your hands as open sores constantly. It didn't actually do anything because who needs to unravel rope? So he was relieved from particular aspects of hard labor. He was also given some better food than the rest of the prisoners were having, because he was basically this chronic dysentery while in prison. He was gravely ill. He could have died in prison, but there was intervention based on the prison authorities that helped to ensure his survival while his 2-year sentence was not shortened. And you know, I think that this is another one of those works, like the example of the Ballad of Reading Jail, that we're aware of issues surrounding prisoners' rights today in the 21st century, but houses of detention in the West, in Europe or in North America, are nothing like what prisons were like in the end of the 19th century, right? So I'm not by any means trivializing what imprisonment is like for 21st century prisoners, but these were not houses of correction, right? These were houses of deliberate, meaningless punishment and mortification of the flesh, right? You know, to kind of ruin the body and ruin the health.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see another hand go up. I know we've heard from you before, but I'll call on you again.
So this is Bill.
Yes.
I think I'm off mute. As you were going through his letters, I was trying to put a label on them. So at the beginning, I'm thinking, I wonder if there's a particular philosophical school that these belong to. And then I said, nah, can't be, because philosophy doesn't brush up that close to religion. And then I wonder if there's a particular theology that you could, you know, that there's a label. And I said, no, this doesn't sound like a theology to me. It's too close to the fringes. But at the end, when you use the word mystic and mystical, I guess that's the label I would apply to it, is mystical. Okay. And so my question is, you know, when he was in jail or prison, he was mystical, but after he was released from prison, did he continue to be mystical?
Okay, I want to give you you've raised a lot of things that are really valuable here. First, I want to speak to anyone who might want to read more about this Oscar Wilde, right? If you're interested in De Profundis, there's a very inexpensive yet excellent copy published by Penguin. The contemporary Irish writer Colm Tóibín, Toibin is the last name, is the editor of that edition of De Profundis. I highly recommend it. It probably will cost you less than $10 on Amazon. Also, if you have an interest in letters more broadly, about 20 years ago, Merlin Holland, Wilde's grandson, revised the Rupert Hart Davis edition from the early 1960s of the letters and published what 20 years ago was the complete letters of Oscar Wilde. And one thing that any publisher or editor has to know is you never want to say the complete anything about a writer when you publish something, because in the last 20 years, people have found more letters written by Oscar Wilde. So it's not the complete letters of Oscar Wilde, but they are available should you wish to purchase that. I like an edition of The Soul of Man Under Socialism that's a little hard to find, but it's also a Penguin edition that's very reasonable. The editor of that is a wonderful scholar by the name of Linda Dowling, Dowling. And I mention her because this edition that's about 20 years old has a really good introductory essay and very good notes. So these are all inexpensive ways should you want to read more about these works. Let me go to the subject next with respect to religion and theology at the time. Then I'll talk about Wilde's post-prison life. So Wilde lived in a century, as I mentioned, he was an Irish Protestant, right, coming to a country that in that century essentially emancipated its Catholic subjects. And in the 1830s, we have the beginning of what's called the Oxford movement. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the name John Henry Newman. Newman was the most famous of the converts to Catholicism in the Victorian period. So just as we have this effort with the Oxford movement to look to the ancient history of the Christian church and make connections with the Church of England and its pre-Reformation past, going back to antiquity and the Middle Ages, you also have this kind of serious movement into Roman Catholicism, which had been, this sort of pariah religion. Many of you, I'm sure, are keenly aware of what a big deal it was when JFK got elected president of the US. And in the 19th century, you have this debate about papal aggression, right? This same of loyalty to a foreign power for English Roman Catholics, right? So somehow in the 19th century, however, you have this interest in Catholic theology. And I'm going somewhere with this because I mentioned Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet. He was another one of those Catholic converts, and there are many versions we can give them. Now, let me just make one point in response to the themes that you have kind of pointed to. What does Catholic theology focus on, but the theology of what we sometimes call the incarnation, right? The Word made flesh, right? And that's what the socialists focused on, that the poor man or the Irishman or whoever it is my brother because of sharing that same spark of the divine, right? And Catholic theology focuses on that pretty hard with the theology of the Eucharist and believing that the bread and wine is the actual body and blood of Christ, right? So why am I bringing this up? Because Wilde and other thinkers of the 19th century were really interested in, for want of a better way of talking about it, religion and the body. And these are themes, but so too are themes in many of the continental writers of the person of Jesus, not Jesus the Christ or Jesus the God, but the teachings of Jesus. I wrote a book on modern Jewish identity. That's a whole other story, but part of liberal Judaism in the 19th century was to recover the Jewishness of Jesus in a century that was part of the anti-Semitism of the century was saying, poof, he came out of nowhere. And Jewish intellectuals at the time, particularly those who had doctorates in philosophy in Germany and places like that, were saying, no, actually, he's a product of a particular tradition, right? So there's a secular approach to studying Christianity at this time, what we sometimes call biblical criticism as well. But there's also this thing, the Catholic revival, and it infuses the art, what I think you're fair to call the theology of the time. And it also infuses that last question or point you made of mysticism. The most famous novel in what we might call the decadent movement was written in 1884 by a man called Joris Karl Huysman. I won't even try to spell it. I'll put it in the chat instead in case anyone wants it. And it's called À rebours, or sometimes translated into English as Against the Grain. And the suggestion there is that if in this sort of imperative to try everything once, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? To live deeply, carpe diem, seize the day, all the possible sensory pleasures. Well, once you've done all of that once you've tried that and material pleasures don't give you any other high, where are you going to go but to like the 70s, right? TM, transcendental meditation. You're going to go to spirituality. You're going to go to indeed mysticism. And there were many writers who were drawn to the esoteric at this time, both in terms of interest in things like non-Western mysticism. Sufi mysticism was brought into this culture in translation at this time, but so too an interest in some of the Christian mystics. Some of you may be familiar with spiritualism. This is the era when people were holding seances, right? And trying to communicate beyond the veil, right? So in this highly scientific age, an age where traditional religion was no longer giving all the answers or all the satisfaction, let's just say avant-garde, edgier intellectuals, artists, theologians were experimenting, recovering, developing on their own new ideas about what our culture would call spirituality. And in a sense, that checking the box, even though I find it very reductive of spiritual but not religious, has its origins in this period. You know, as people are thinking about a kind of what we might call a post-Christian Western world, in saying, what can we take from it? What can we recover from it and make our own? I'm sorry, I could talk forever on this, so I apologize if I'm saying too much. Yes, I'm sorry, but why Kay?
Okay, because your discussion about religion has brought to mind, I'm very interested in the American founding fathers and our Constitution, and so many of them were deists. In fact, Thomas Jefferson rewrote the New Testament, leaving out the miracles, because he could accept the philosophy of Christ, but not the miracles. So how would you, in a way, this sounds like, I mean, this reconfiguration of taking the philosophical ideas of Christ and kind of, but not the miraculous. Is that kind of what you would think would resonate more with Wilde?
Let me give an example here. We can listen to the St. Matthew's Passion without necessarily professing the faith that it may be based on. We can go to Notre Dame, poor Notre Dame, but you can go to any of the cathedrals, right, and have a sense of awe without necessarily professing those faiths. So you really have two things operating here. In Wilde, you have that. I'm going to talk for a moment about what we sometimes call secular humanism, right? So that emerges in the 19th century, and I'll talk about that in just a second. You do have this sort of humanistic focus that I think many of us share as common ground across whatever religious traditions or lack thereof we may have in our communities. But with Wilde, there's also the element of the mystery. There's that element of the beautiful. There's that element of, the word, the mystical, right? This goes back to that notion that emerges in the late 18th century that was a very secular moment, post-Enlightenment, post-French Revolution, of the idea of the sublime, right? That the Romantic poets talked about, that you could look at Mont Blanc and have your breath taken away, and you are transported to another realm. And that other realm mightn't be, anything that you learned about in Sunday school, but it's a transformative experience. And what Wilde and people like him are saying is that art does that to you. And I think that many of us would agree with that with regard to symphonies and the great masses written by the Western composers, right? Or the beautiful Renaissance works of art that depict Christ or Mary or whatever, that there can be something transcendent without the embrace of a belief system. But what I would want to say is that humanism didn't come out of nowhere. The wonderful Victorian novelist, George Eliot, aka Mary Ann Evans, had an evangelical upbringing. She read German higher criticism. She read biblical criticism. She sort of became an agnostic, but she writes these novels about, how we should live our lives and the ethical society and the ethical community. And in fact, just to speak to the American version of this, the Society for Ethical Culture that was founded in the late 19th century by a person called Adler. Well, his father was a Reform rabbi at Temple Emmanuel, New York City. So these sort of ethical principles coming out of liberal religion, and Unitarianism is a really good example as well, that they become ways in which people are maybe no longer professing a religious faith, but taking the sort of prophetic truths in them in knowing how to live. And then what I suggest here is that that can be didactic, it can teach you, but as the Roman poet Horace said in his Ars Poetica, art is supposed to do two things: to teach, but also to delight. And what Wilde is focusing on, the aspect of delight, right? To take your breath away, right? If we only have the ethical teachings alone, then what of beauty? What of transcendence? And if we have beauty and transcendence without deep human experience, then you probably haven't lived. So what happens in De Profundis is Wilde takes the experience of human suffering and turns it into, as it were, an artistic moment, an aesthetic moment, by writing about it. I regularly teach a course in Holocaust literature, and there are classics of the works of the literature of genocide that we see how exquisite they are, and yet they've come out of a time of fascist genocide, right? And so art and human suffering are not necessarily incompatible. Anyway, I'm preaching. I'll stop right now. Other comments and questions? Yes, Sarah Simon, if you'd unmute yourself.
There we go. When do you teach that class, please? The Holocaust literature.
I last taught it in spring 2020. I usually teach it about every 2 years because for my mental health, I consider it not to be such a good thing to teach too regularly.
Yeah, it's not the best subject. No, it's very awful. It's so awful.
No. But, one of the things I regularly do at the Stanford campus, we do a number of programming there in Judaic studies, and I've been coordinating some of that. But for many years, I've always brought someone for a Holocaust remembrance lecture in April for Yom HaShoah. So, there are ways in which we can remember without necessarily looking in a dark place all the time. And I might say, I'm not sure I would want to teach Wilde's De Profundis every semester either, even though I've written about it extensively. So anyway.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering because I would like to attend that.
Okay, well,
You're available.
if you can come down to Stanford, you're welcome to. If not, my colleague Margaret Breen at the Storrs campus regularly teaches that course as well. So,
They don't have it on virtual like this, virtual?
Can I be honest and say, I hope not? I had to finish it virtual last spring, but I confess I really look forward to in-person teaching. I will tell you, however, if you have an interest in Holocaust studies, there are many webinars and Zooms available in that field. The DC Museum's website is terrific. ushmm.org is a really great resource to continue learning about that.
What was that website, sir?
Sure. It's the website of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is, I'll just type it in the chat.
Yes, please.
ushmm.org. Well, we've certainly been all over the place, from Wilde's comedies to the American or the DC Holocaust Museum. Yes, Robin Levine, if you would unmute yourself if you can. There you go.
Am I unmuted?
We can hear you.
I was just going to say, when you were talking about it with the Holocaust course that you teach, some of the Holocaust victims, if you look at them, there's most beautiful art that you could possibly see. And if you're a member of a lot of the Jewish organizations in the Holocaust Museum, they will send you, when you make donations, they send you cards
Right.
that were done by Holocaust victims, and they're beautiful works of art. So thank you for that.
Well, and thank you for adding that. I think as we've headed in this direction, I think it brings to a broader question. And that's first for me to say, I don't think there's any coincidence that I have published on and taught about both Wilde's De Profundis and Holocaust literature, because I'm very interested in this issue that we're kind of circling around, and that's to say, what's the relationship between the human capacity to create art and to both experience and stand in some relation to beautiful, while also looking at the very depths of human suffering and indeed destruction. And I have to say that there are ethical questions here too. On the one hand, we can have a story of the phoenix rising from the ashes, but to go back to the part of the question that I didn't answer for, let's see, where is he now? For the gentleman who asked, Bill, who asked me earlier, Wilde did not have some fabulous career after his release from prison. He was released from prison in 1897. He died in 1900. He lived on other people's money at that time. He was virtually penniless, and what he had, he gave to Bosie, which means you have to be really careful about the power your ex has over you. But in any case, Wilde did not resurrect his career. There are a couple of works that I would recommend to you if you have an interest in this. The wonderful English playwright David Hare wrote a work called The Judas Kiss, and obviously really drawing on Christian stories there. But about a couple of years ago, I saw a revival of it that Rupert Everett was playing Wilde in it. But there are two acts to this play. The first act is when Wilde knew he was going to go to prison, and the Crown, the police authorities, were deliberately giving him enough time to leave England. As a criminal convicted of crimes of gross indecency, he just needed to get to Dover and hop a boat to Calais, because once he'd be in France, he'd be in a country that was the laws were the Napoleonic Code that did not prosecute for crimes of same-sex acts, right? And yet he didn't. So the question of why Wilde didn't leave, Robin, if you'll forgive me for making a comparison here, so often we wonder why, I'll dare say, because I can draw on this in my own family's history, why did some of our relatives not get visas when they could have? Why, but hindsight is 20/20, right? Did Wilde not take that boat to Calais because he assumed that the British public was not going to let him go to prison after all? Did he not flee England because of his very politically engaged, strong, courageous mother who would have said to run away as a coward is not what Oscar Wilde should do. We really don't know. But the second act of the play is Wilde in Italy with again his literary executor Robbie Ross floating in and out, Lord Alfred Douglas floating in and out, and it's a very sad second act because Wilde is continuing to live and yet is not ever recovering from what has happened. I'm going to type another name into the chat. Nicholas Frankel is a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. If you have an interest in Wilde's post-prison life, Frankel's biography of Wilde is, to me, iconoclastic in terms of really challenging our understanding of Wilde, because he suggests, and I love Nick Frankel, it's not that I'm disagreeing with him, it's a wonderful biography, but he actually suggests that those post-prison years for Wilde were rich and productive ones, even though they didn't involve fame, celebrity, wealth. And our general narrative about Wilde has been this notion that after prison that was it. He did die for questions of religion. He did die a Roman Catholic. He had a deathbed conversion. But even in the deathbed, I better leave you with something a little cheerier. Some of you may have heard this line that he's lying in this sort of grim Paris hotel room, looking at the rather unattractive wallpaper, and he knows he's dying. He developed meningitis from an inner ear infection. And of course, there weren't good treatments for infections at the turn of the century. There's a controversy as to whether or not Wilde was syphilitic or not. We don't know if he had syphilis or not. But anyway, his line about the wallpaper as he's lying there in bed dying is, one of us has to go. Either the wallpaper has to go or I do, because he found it so offensive to his aesthetic sensibilities. So he kept his sense of humor even in extremis, in extreme circumstances of health. Bill, you've got the record insofar as the number of hands up, but I'll take it that you're not taking up anybody else's time. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and I know everybody wants to leave in 5 minutes, so try to make this quick.
I can stay here all day. Everybody else can leave, but I don't know what the hosts want.
I mean, and this one's way out there. This one is a stretch. When you were talking about Wilde in prison, he had some very unconventional thoughts about Jesus.
Yes.
And that made me think of Nikos Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation of Christ, which is very unconventional thoughts about Jesus, but of a different sort. Have any connections, I'll use the word connections, ever been made between Wilde's thought process and Kazantzakis' thought process?
This is the 2:41 p.m. answer. Yes. No, but a number of us, myself included, have written about Wilde's unconventional writings about Jesus in relation to other thinkers. Ernest Renan, for instance, Vie de Jésus in the 19th century. You have many folks who are putting forward this figure in such extraordinary ways. What I'd like to, though, circle back to is what about conventional writers or conventional theologians thinking about Wilde's writings about Jesus? And I learned about, like I say, 25 plus years ago, that there's a Trappist monk. You know about the Trappists that take a vow of silence. Thomas Merton was a Trappist who lives in a monastery in Conyers, Georgia, who wrote 2 articles in a scholarly journal called the American Benedictine Review. So a scholarly journal that has a Roman Catholic orientation about Wilde's theology of Christ. So the interesting part is to see it from the other side too, rather than our sort of secular academic approach to this figure writing unconventionally about Jesus. What happens when someone from within an established religion begins to examine Wilde's thought? So while I don't think that given whatever Pope Francis has said, who am I to judge, right? The famous quote from Pope Francis. Well, I don't think that Oscar Wilde is ever going to be canonized a saint in the Roman Catholic Church or maybe in some others. But in any case, suffice it to say that his writings about Christianity, while they have not been addressed by many thinkers, they have not gone unnoticed either. And the thing that was kind of a coincidence that there were three of us when I finished my doctoral dissertation and then published a version of it as my first book about 20 years ago. There were about three of us, a fellow named Ellis Hansen, a fellow named Patrick O'Malley, and I were all thinking about these questions. We're all about the same generation. Patrick teaches at Georgetown, and Ellis teaches at Cornell, and we were all writing about this really funny thing that was happening among these late 19th century sexually transgressive artists and thinkers, that they were writing about religion in a kind of iconoclastic way. So I think that also says something about our culture in the late 1990s. What kinds of changes were happening, right? In my lifetime, I can hardly imagine when I was an undergraduate 30 years ago that same-sex marriage would be legal in the US, right? So in that decade following, right, into the 1990s, when I was in graduate school and engaging these kinds of questions, there was tremendous social change that led us to ask these kinds of questions. And I have to say, I'm not sure, in the 1990s, who was more scandalized by the themes I was addressing about Wilde and religion, the people in religious studies, some of whom might find his homosexuality to be problematic, or the people in gay studies or queer theory who would be like, you're writing on religion? Why? So it was an interesting time. Now, 20 years later, we're living in a very different culture. I hope you had fun. I don't need to run, but I don't want to keep, I hope I haven't talked too much, because I have that bad habit of talking too much.
Oh, stop. I enjoyed it very much, immensely. Thank you, sir. That was great.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was really an excellent talk, certainly a whole different aspect of Oscar Wilde than I've ever heard of before. So we really appreciate your speaking to us today.
I'm so glad. What I'm just going to say again, just so it's fresh in everybody's chat window, if for any reason you have other questions, or if you want a copy of my PowerPoint that has the quotations, I just put my UConn email address in the chat box again. So, feel free to reach out to me if you either want a copy of the PowerPoint. I would have handed it to you as a paper handout if we were in person. So I feel like I need to offer it to you electronically. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
I just really want to thank you. It was really a great presentation and great discussions too.
Well, that's where I was going to go. Thank all of you for your amazing questions, your attention, and for giving me the goodie of being able to sit here and talk with you about an unconventional approach to Oscar Wilde for the last hour and a half. So thank you for brightening my snow day. And please be safe. Be careful in the winter weather.
Thanks very much.
Brad,
Thank you.
Fred, we're having you back next year.
It sounds fun to me. I'll come up, even if we're in person. I will gladly travel to stores because we are all wanting to be in person if possible. So.
Well, we'll get you a lunch, whatever happens.
Oh, don't worry. And the reason that, for those of you who are hearing that, I was teasing earlier and saying that, you know, there wasn't a call from the doorman at the building where I live saying, somebody sent you a sandwich. So that's why the lunch line came up. But thank you all. I enjoyed this so much, and good health, be safe, stay well, and take good care. Thanks for having me. Bye. I feel special. I'm being clapped for. I think there's a reaction. I think I can clap for you now. There's a special little emoji where I've just used it to clap for you. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Now the presenter. Okay.
All right, where's the snow?
Well, you know, when I listened to the weather, they said it would like come and go and come and go and come and go.
Oh. Yeah, the roads are completely, you can't tell from where you are, but the road is no snow whatsoever on the road.
Yeah, there's
street
nothing like
outside.
driveway, it's not sticking. So
Yeah. Well, that's good. That means so far no shoveling
but
because
it's
all
going to
the
snow
water.
until noon tomorrow.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
That's like a curse.
Yeah.
2 participants are waiting in the lobby. Who is that?
I moved them to the lobby. I don't think those 2 are there anymore.
Oh, okay.
So I moved them to the lobby.
Wow, that's oh my goodness. Yeah. So when I saw this, I didn't realize that you were using the sign-in information that was on the site when you communicated with Fred to give him the way to sign into the thing. So I need to, and I didn't realize this, and that was good that this happened, that I need to start every meeting for the rest of this term. Okay, I will do that.
Yes, yes.
All right, so we got that down. Anything else going on besides my back is already starting to hurt just looking at the potential for the snow.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, so we're supposed to get 4 to 6 inches. So,
Let's hope for 4.
all right. Well, I'll vote. Let's have a vote on that. Unanimous. Good. All right, good.
All right,
right.
and tomorrow we've got the executive committee meeting.
Yeah. Okay. We'll see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock then.
Okay, sounds good.
All right.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.